Anthony Casablanca has over 30 years of executive leadership experience, and in 2009 he was recognized as the Outstanding Human Resource Executive for the state of Indiana. After he retired from Hillenbrand Industries, he and his brother began a leadership training and consulting firm called GriefLeaders, and they co-authored the book, The Dying Art of Leadership, which he's going to be talking about today. So please just give a warm welcome, Columbus welcome to Anthony Casablanca.
Yeah, you can just turn that off. Super. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Well, thanks so much, Jeff and Steve. What I guess I need you to...
Yeah, I'll change.
Okay. Housekeeping. Can you guys hear me in the back? Super, because if I have to manage this and a microphone, it'll get ugly fast. Thanks again to the Kiwanis. Treated us so well in organizing this and promoting this, and so we appreciate that. Also, thanks to Jewel Rettman Funeral Home for sponsoring the event and providing the books. So just real quick, I'm on a clock. I normally don't like presentations where I'm talking and you're listening, and then the presentation's over and we get up and leave. But if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to fly through some concepts here. So if you wouldn't mind, jot down questions or just keep them sort of tucked away in the back of your head. There will be time at the end, and I'll deal with questions then, just to save time. So real quick, we're going to talk about a couple of things today, but first and foremost, some staggering facts about our topic today. It's not a matter of if, but when every single person in this room, every single leader in the country, every single organization will deal with this. No one is immune from the topic that we're going to talk about today. It costs organizations about $75 to $100 billion a year, and 1 in 4 people is dealing with this issue every single day, right? So, I used to be able to say, well, when you go back to your office, but these days that's a little different. But 1 in 4 people, $75 to $100 billion a year in lost productivity, and no amount of continuous improvement or lean or Kaizen will ever uncover what we're talking about here, right? So we'll do a little word association real quick. What's the first word that comes to mind? What's the first thing you think about when you hear the term grief or grieving? Just death. Absolutely. Absolutely. Every time we do this, that's the number one answer. It is the number one thing that people think about. But the reality is that is a very narrow definition of grief. What actually happens is any traumatic event in a person's life will cause them to enter the stages of grief, right? And that's why the numbers are so big. Because if you're just thinking about the loss of a loved one, that does impact a lot of people every year, but it doesn't impact nearly the number of people when you give it such a broad definition, right? When you think about it that broadly, suddenly things like divorce, a significant illness diagnosis of yourself or a family member dealing with opioid crisis, right? An opioid addiction. The list goes domestic abuse. The list goes on and on of the events that will cause a person's sense of reality to be altered. And one in particular that we could stand here for 2 days and no one would probably ever put on the list is a company's own initiatives that they put into place, right? Reducing benefits, closing plants, eliminating jobs, right? Putting in new computer systems. All of those things create significant change in people's lives. And so we set out to do something about that based on this quote, right? As we were pulling together our book and doing some research, this is a quote from a gentleman by the name of James Autry. He's a business leader and a leadership author, actually. And this quote caught our attention that, what we're going to talk about today is not taught in any business school. It's not taught in any leadership program. And in fact, there's very little been written about it. And so this book turned quickly from a project to a mission to a passion for my brother and I. And we started the process a couple of years ago, and the book was finally published in October. And obviously the leadership training program has come out quickly on the heels of that. So let's talk a little bit, because I got to point it right at it. So a common misconception is that people don't want to talk about this, and that is not true. This is just a handful. I could have put 3 more pages of articles that have appeared just in the last 2 years about this topic and how people want to talk about this in the workplace, right? Emotional safety, emotional well-being, mental health is a big issue that corporations are dealing with right now, because people feel that, and rightfully so, work is such a big part of their lives, right? They can't just check, they can't check the personal side at the door, especially now where everybody's working from home, right? Those lines are blurred more now than they've ever been, right? So, lest you think it's just a Harvard Business Review marketing propaganda thing, since all of those were from Harvard Business Review, there was an article in January of this year in the Washington Post about how the world needs grief leaders. There was also McKinsey published an article a few months ago about grief in the workplace and the hidden impacts of the perils of unresolved grief in the workplace. And probably most important to my brother and I, when we were researching the book, these 2 quotes were said by every single person that we talked to, and frankly that we continue to talk to as we travel around during the training. Folks either said, I was so thankful I was able to talk about my situation at work because it made things so much easier to deal with, so much less stress. I felt supported and like the organization really cared about me. Or they said, I wish I had been able to talk about this at work because it would have made things so much easier to deal with, right? So let's talk a little bit about this. You're going to see these images. You'll see this image a couple of more times in the presentation, but I think it's a really good graphic of how we should think about grief and the impact that it has on people and performance and organizations, right? If you think about this as a storm, right, as a supercell that's going to generate ultimately a tornado, the traumatic event is up in the clouds, it strikes, the tornado forms, that's the grief, and that grief ultimately turns into the devastation on the ground, right? And that devastation can be in a person's personal life, right? Divorce, alcohol, drug addiction, or it can manifest itself at work through performance issues. And as we talk about grief, it's very common that people refer to the 5 stages of grief, right? And so the first stage is denial. And that stage is often misunderstood. It's not denying that the event happened. It's just that you can't believe it happened to you, right? I'm sure, sadly, a couple of months ago, right, I'm sure there were a bunch of people in Indianapolis who woke up and thought, my God, these shootings happen in other cities. They don't happen here, right? So that's denial. And confusion, fear, numbness, right? That's what people experience when they are in that stage, which obviously can lead to unproductive behavior at work or performance issues at work. Anger, right? Frustration, anxiety, unproductive behavior. People are lashing out. They're angry at themselves. They're angry at others. They're angry at the situation, right? Again, a situation or an emotion that is hard to control, right? Folks might be very easy to flare up or express emotion, or frankly, they may sit very quietly and just sort of go deep inside, right? The third stage is bargaining. This is a very interesting stage. This is where you start to question whether or not you could have done something different. It's actually it presents a very interesting leadership challenge, because if you have somebody saying, oh my gosh, I wonder if I would have done this if the situation would have been different, right? I wonder if I would have done this, my wife wouldn't have left me. I wonder if I would have done this if my son wouldn't have been exposed or gotten cancer, right? And obviously, if the leader says, yeah, you're probably right, if you'd have done that, things would have turned out a lot different, we'll just fuel the fire, right? That just makes things worse. But it's a really important part of a person's recovery, because this is where they want to talk to people about things. So this is where, at work, some unproductive behavior can be generated just because this person wants to talk to folks about what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, what they're dealing with. Then, of course, there's depression. This is where a big piece of the performance issues happen, right? Because the person gets depressed, they don't want to be at work, they're questioning whether any of this even makes sense anymore, right? What's life really all about based on the things that I'm experiencing? Why am I spending all this time at work, right? All kinds of thoughts go through people's heads in that stage. And then that finally leads to acceptance. Now, unfortunately, this is a nice, neat, clean model, but nobody goes through the phases of grief in that order or that cleanly or in a way that you can really determine. It's not like you can go, okay, they're in the bargaining stage, so we just got to get through depression and then we'll be okay, right? It doesn't work that way. And the reason that it doesn't work that way, and while I'm really hesitant because you can't put grief into a formula, right? If any of you are accountants or engineers or have a bent towards numbers, you can't make this a formula. But there are some things that determine how a person grieves, and one of them is the depth of the relationship that they have to the event that occurred, right? So I am a whole lot more impacted if I lose my job than if you do, right? When you take that and you lay on top of that, or you multiply that by the suddenness of the event, those two things are what cause people the level of grief that people have, and it's why no two people grieve the same, right? And then that gets compounded by the complicating factors in people's lives. And those are the things that we typically don't know about, right? And so when that formula sort of plays out, right, if it's something that I'm really close to, if it's something I didn't see coming, and I have a whole bunch of other things going on in my life that compound the issue, grief is deep. Grief is complex, right? And it's why no two people grieve the same. It's why even the same event, it's why you can't compare grief, right? It doesn't matter how similar the events may be, right? When I lost my dad, it's different than your dad, even if they had the exact same disease and they were in the same hospital, doesn't really matter, right? You can't really compare grief. And that's true, and that's what leads to the awkwardness of this situation, right? Because we want to say something, we want to do something, right? And we don't know what to do or say. So no two people grieve the same. Similar traumatic events are not the same, no matter how similar they seem. Grief is not linear, and grief has its own timeline. And all of this plays out at work, right? Because again, you can't check your grief at the door, right? You can't check that emotional trauma at the door. All you have to do is watch any episode of Undercover Boss to watch this play out, right, in a person, and get a sense for all of the things that people deal with on a daily basis that we don't even talk about, right? That we don't even know about, right? But they're struggling. So, typically what winds up happening in these situations is the leader waits for the performance issue to arise, and then they deal with the performance. And in fact, in most organizations, leaders tend to get rewarded for dealing with performance issues fast, quickly, building high-performance teams, right, developing a talent. So they wait for the performance issue to happen, then they address the performance issue, which actually just adds another compounding factor to this equation, right? Because now the person's not only dealing with whatever the situation is that they're dealing with, now they're also worried about losing their job, right? And I never really thought about that, but our son was battling lymphoma cancer a couple of years ago, and I went to his treatments, and I noticed that every single treatment we went to, they would ask him about his job. And I finally asked the nurse, why do you do that? And she said, because it is frightening the number of people who have to battle cancer and also worry about losing their job, right? So, performance issues. Actually, the way to handle this, and what we try to help leaders understand, is the sooner you can engage and talk about this and begin to work with the person and support them, you can avoid a bunch of what may be coming down the road, and the person's engagement, loyalty, productivity, the team's morale, all of it will go up if the leader actually engages, instead of stepping back and thinking, well, they're back at work, everything must be fine. Or, this is really awkward, really uncomfortable, really emotional, I don't want to deal with this, we'll just pretend like it didn't happen. And that only makes matters worse, right? Make sense? So, we're going to talk a little bit now about the leadership model and the things that we teach in our leadership training, which are all in the book. But to do that, so we teach adaptive leadership, but to do that, you got to compare it to something. And what we compare it to, and I have fallen into this trap, is what's known as managing uniformly. So managing uniformly is when a leader, a manager, a boss, they get very comfortable with a leadership style that they have. And they take that leadership style and they apply it to every person, every situation, every career, because that's the way I lead, right? Whatever that style might be. The belief there is that I lead this way and the rest of you should adapt to my leadership style. Effective leaders, great leaders, take a totally different approach, right? Their view of the world is, it's my job as the leader to adapt my leadership style to fit the situation that my people are in, be it their career, their development, their new assignment, right? The stuff that's going on in their personal lives. And this is a real art, right? And it's actually another thing that's not taught very often in leadership schools anymore, right? So adaptive leadership versus managing uniformly, right? There's actually 5 attributes to adaptive leadership. I'm sure everyone in the room can count. You're going, well, there's only 4 on the slide. Give me a little creative flair here, a little drama, if you will. So the first 4 flow on the same scale, right? Stewardship, trust, empowerment, and collaboration all run from low to high. Stewardship, and these are all things that an employee would demonstrate in the workplace, right? So stewardship is the employee doing all of the things that they should be doing in order to grow in their job and take responsibility for their job and accountability for their growth and their role, right? Are they getting results? Are they working a development plan, right? Are they learning? Are they growing? And are they taking responsibility for it? As that goes up, the leader's trust can go up, right? So you can begin to trust the employee more with different assignments, more decision-making, more authority, those kinds of things. Same with empowerment. And the same with collaboration. So a person who is really high on all of these scales, your typical high-performing, high potential, you're collaborating with them a lot, right? You're not doing things like saying, go fill out this spreadsheet, come back to me when you got that done and let's talk about it, right? When somebody is very high on these scales, you're actually talking to them about, how do you think this assignment should be structured? What do you think the goals should be, right? You are turning over a lot of that decision-making and authority and responsibility for what needs to get done to the person. And when that happens, the 5th element then of adaptive leadership is communication frequency. And ironically, the person who is very high on this scale, you don't have to talk to them very much, right? You spend a lot of time at the beginning agreeing on the what and the why and the how, and you actually turn that over to them and say, I'd really like you to figure this out, and come talk to me a little bit about what your thoughts are, and then we'll decide together. But once that discussion happens, they're off. It's up to them to get it done, right? And you can trust that they will, and they'll come talk to you if they need help, and you just need to check in with them periodically. On the other end of the spectrum, though, the person who's new in their role, maybe they're struggling in their role, maybe they're new to the assignment, they're lower on the scale. So you're spending a lot of time talking with them, right? That's adaptive leadership, right? That's adaptive leadership. And there's actually characteristics that we talk about in the book that I won't go into here around decision making and authority and responsibility that move on this same scale. So I took you through that because I want you to understand these couple of points. So we just talked about this, right? When you plot people on the typical performance and potential scale, and you overlay those 5 characteristics, right? You get the person at the bottom that I just described, needs lots of attention, lots of guidance, right? Let's go do this, come back and talk to me. On the other end of the spectrum, you get the person at the top, who we also talked about, which is you're talking a lot about how things should be done, what do they think, turning over a lot of decision making and authority to them. Person in the middle, sort of interesting because they act like both of those people at times, right? There's times when they can be empowered and you can adapt your style and treat them more like the person in the top. And then there's times where maybe they're not quite as confident. Maybe this is a new assignment for them or something that they've never dealt with before. And so you need to be a little bit more involved, right? And what typically winds up happening when you're managing uniformly is your style that you are only using all the time doesn't ever match where people are on this graph because they're moving all the time and you're treating them all the same. So I didn't take you through that to make you a management expert. I took you through that because what I really want you to remember is that when a traumatic event occurs in somebody's life, they are not the same person that they were before that event happened, right? And that's where leadership comes in, right? I don't care how good the employee is. I don't care where they were on that matrix or are on that matrix. When the event happens, they are a different person, right? And the leader needs to adapt their style in order to help that person support. Let's not use the word help. Support that person at a time when they need the support the most. And if you remember that tornado graph, the leaders typically, because there's no training on this, leaders typically don't make that adjustment. They just keep leading the way they always have. The person's performance is impacted by the traumatic event. Performance issues occur. Now we're talking about, gee, if you want to keep your job, you got to do this, that, or the other thing, right? Which then just compounds the problem. And those situations tend to end poorly, right? Either the employee says, I don't think this is a company I want to work for anymore, and they leave. Or the manager says, your performance isn't improving, so I'm terminating you, right? Or probably the worst case is the employee stays and they never feel the same about the leader or the company again, and their morale just sort of begins to slip, and their loyalty slips, and their productivity slips, right? And the team around them who has watched what goes on goes through the exact same thing, right? And that's how folks begin to separate themselves from. That's when you start to get the we versus they mentality, right? So keep that image in mind because it's really a key point. One of the questions we get a lot is, we got a lot going on, especially now, right? Companies are trying to get back to pre-COVID profitability levels. We got a lot going on. We got all kinds of initiatives going on. I don't see where this fits in what we do as a company or what we're struggling with right now. And so we're often asked to answer this question. And we'll start with, well, I thought we would start with it. There we go. We'll start with safety, right? We talked a little bit about this before. Most organizations view safety as a physical thing, right? I don't want people to get hurt at work. But there's a whole nother component that great organizations recognize as safety, which is the emotional component, right? When you create an emotionally safe environment for people, productivity, loyalty, engagement, all of those metrics go up, right? And you build an incredibly strong team who's not afraid to raise their hand and actually challenge the thinking in the organization. So great organizations think about safety far more broadly, and they start to think about it as emotional safety at work, which is really what we're talking about here. Diversity and inclusion. Steve mentioned this in his comments. If your organization is thinking about diversity and inclusion as we're underrepresented in particular classes of people, you're probably missing the point. Diversity and inclusion is really about the person being able to bring their whole self to work and not have to check part of who they are at the door. That's what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about not having an emotionally traumatized person have to pretend that that part of them doesn't exist while they're at work, right? And the leader who can work with the employee and support the employee through the traumatic event and support them the way they need to by doing things as simple as letting them talk about it, letting them know that they can come in and raise their hand and say, I need help, right? All the way to shifting work assignments, responsibilities, those kinds of things to give people the space that they may need during that time, right? So diversity and inclusion, being able to bring your whole self to work and being recognized and supported. Lean, continuous improvement, we've talked a little bit about that, but at the end of the day, if you view continuous improvement as just cost cutting, you probably will have missed the point that we're trying to make here. But the reality is a true lean transformation, true continuous improvement culture in an organization is really all about respect for people, right? And so if you're expecting a traumatized employee to leave that trauma at the door and not bring it to work, that's really not respecting people, right? In fact, you'll see a slide at the end. We're going to be doing a seminar, a series of webinars called Respect for People, Conversations Leaders Aren't Having with Their Employees. This is a conversation that should be had. Now, we also recognize that most leaders have never been trained on how to have these conversations, and that's what the book and our training is really all about. Change management. So if you've got a huge initiative going on at work, and a person who's exhibiting denial and anger and depression will often get labeled as resistant to change. And that may not be the case. They might actually just be grieving this enormous change that's going to come into their work life as a result of the initiative that the company is putting in place. So what we would argue to companies is that if you have a change management plan and that plan does not include a grief leadership training component, you really just have a communication plan, right? You're really just sitting people down and saying, this is coming, get over it, this is how life is, right? And we would say there's probably a better way to do that. And then the last one on here is resilience efforts, right? There's an awful lot of talk nowadays. COVID taught us a lot about the resilience of organizations and their strategy processes and their supply chains. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how resilient you make your processes, they're still run by people. And if you're not helping your people be more resilient, your processes aren't going to be as resilient as they could be. And this is really about helping employees be more resilient in the workplace, right? By adapting your leadership and supporting them at a time when they need the support the most. So, some pictures that I hope you will remember from the presentation. If you don't remember a word I said, if you could just remember these pictures, you will pass the quiz at the end, right? So, it impacts everybody, 1 in 4 people, right? It's not a matter of if, it's when. No one's immune. Every single organization, every single person, every single leader is going to have to deal with this because emotionally traumatic events happen in people's lives every day, right? $75 to $100 billion in lost productivity just in the US, 1 in 4 people, dealing with the issue on a daily basis. Any emotionally traumatic event will cause that alters a person's sense of reality, will put them in the stages of grief. So it's not just a death, right? Great leaders get involved as early as possible, and they work with the employee on how to support them best through their situation. They convey that the organization and they care about the person, right? As opposed to dealing with the performance issue. No matter where you fall on the matrix, you're never the same person after the event happens, ever, right? You never get over grief. You just get through it, right? Those emotionally traumatic events shape and change who we are, always, right? And there's triggers that will happen throughout a person's life that will bring them back and cause them to grieve all over again. Might just be for a split second, right? Might just be for a split second, but they happen. I will let you read this one, but I had a conversation with a CEO from northern Indiana, and basically he said, I get it. These were his words. I get it. My people are grieving. They're grieving all the crap that happened with COVID and the fact that we lost 50% of our revenues and we had to restructure our company. And now they're grieving that in 2021, we're going to get most of that revenue back. We have to hire 400 people in the next 3 months. And my people are saying, what more do you want from me? Right? And that's just the stuff that's happening at work. And it was really interesting because he told me he went to his board of directors and he told them that the single biggest challenge to them hitting their objectives in 2021, to them successfully achieving their plan, was their organization's personal resilience, right? And that's what this is really all about. And then it's on the book. You got a business card, but I hope you never ever forget this image, right? That's our company logo. Right? And we're more than happy to come in, do an event like this for your group, your team, do a book signing, do a session, or actually come in and train. We'll work kids' birthday parties and weddings and bar mitzvahs, whatever you need, whatever you need. So this is a good place to stop, and I'll take questions. I was hoping you were keeping time. I'm not sure if you were.
It's 22, so you're good.
We're good? Cool. So The Dying Art of Leadership, you all got the book. You can buy it on Amazon or at BookBaby. You can visit our website, and I'd love to hear from you, really would. Feedback on today's session, whatever. Connect with me on LinkedIn. You can follow us there as well. Again, thanks so much to Jeff and Steve and everybody at Kiwanis. Truly, you guys made me feel like I was a best-selling author coming in to talk to you, right? And just a guy down the road from Batesville, Indiana. But and again, thanks to Jewel Rittman for supplying the books. That was so gracious of them to do that. And this was the webinar that I mentioned. Any questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Would you agree with the statement that 80% of the people who quit their jobs don't do it because of the money or the company, but because of their immediate boss?
I would, absolutely. I would, absolutely. Yes, I would. Having been in that situation, I mean, I was the VP of HR for Batesville Casket Company, and then I went on to run an operating company for them. I see it all the time. In fact, it's really interesting when I was asked to go run the operating company, which was a subsidiary of Hillenbrand Industries in Cincinnati. It was a privately held company that had been acquired, and then Hillenbrand bought them. But the individual who asked me if I would go run the company made a really interesting statement to me. He said, we want you to go consider running that company because we need somebody at the top who has a heart. So I would say it might be 90% of people don't leave for the money. Yeah, yeah. So what else? Great question. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
What about when it's the leader themselves who has experienced the traumatic event
Yes. Yes, great question. So the question was, what if it's the leader? So we talked a lot about the employee. What if it's the leader who experiences the traumatic event? There's actually a chapter in the book, it's chapter 9, it's called The Person in the Mirror. And yes, the most effective way for the leader to build this culture is to model it himself or herself, right? So we would say, share, right? Be vulnerable. Go to your team and say, I'm struggling, and I'm going to need your help. And here's what we're going to have to do. Because the team wants to help. They just don't know how. And that's true even when it's a team member who's struggling, right? The team wants to help them, but they don't know how, right? And so our advice to leaders is once they have the conversation with the person and they start to talk about how they could help them, they should go back to the team and talk to the team about it and say, here's how we're going to help Anthony get through this, right? And I know there's some of you in the room probably going HIPAA and privacy, and there's no laws against listening. And you don't have to divulge anything, right? You don't have to say what Anthony's struggling with. You just need to say, hey, look, he's going to need some time, he's going to need some space, he's going to need some time off, so we're going to rearrange some things. And the team will be more than happy to help. And when the leader admits that themselves, the morale, the engagement, the loyalty, the camaraderie just goes through the roof in an organization because they realize that the organization realizes that they're people, right? It's really interesting. Every single person we talk to ends their conversation with us with the same exact sentence. And that is, but if I worked for a different leader, I don't know if I'd have been treated the same way, right? So yes, the leader should model the behavior. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I suspicion there are some here today saying this is really neat, but this is kind of like eating a whale.
Yeah.
And you do that one bite of it at a time. So what's the first bite?
Yeah. So the first bite, so it's a great question. We get asked this all the time when we're doing interviews, right? Everybody wants to know what are the 3 tips you'd give leaders to deal with this, right? And the first tip is engage, right? Have the conversation. It's going to be awkward, it's going to be emotional, it's going to be uncomfortable, but have the conversation, right? Sit down, close the door, say, look, I understand whatever's going on. Let's talk about how we can help you, right? Or, I don't understand what's going on, but I've noticed this behavior or that behavior. Let's talk about this, right? Let's get this out in the open. The second one is actually do something after you talk to people, right? Actually do something with what you've learned. It doesn't do any good if you sit and listen and then you go, well, sucks to be you. Get over it because we got work to do, right? So actually make some changes. The third piece is involve the team. And the last piece is be vulnerable yourself, because you can't have the first conversation if you're not willing to be vulnerable, right? You have to be willing to let your guard down, tell the person that you understand, right? And that you want to help and the organization wants to help. And so just know that if you don't want to talk about it now, just know you can come in my office, raise your hand and say, I'm struggling and I'm here for you. That's the first step. Great question. Thank you for asking that. Anything else?
Anthony, a lot of this is work-related, but I think it can also apply to like an organization like Kiwanis or volunteers at church, you know, the team that you're working with at church. I think it's the same.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it works on an individual level too, right? How many times, I am still guilty of this, and I'm ashamed to admit it, but I'm still guilty of this. Walking through Kroger, and I see a friend, and I know they're struggling with something, and the first thought that goes through my mind is, oh my God, I hope they don't see me, because I don't want to talk to them, because I don't know what to say, right? We all do it. We've all been there. Everything that you will read in the book can be applied on a one-on-one situation with your friend or a family member or anyone who's struggling with anything. That's actually been one of the biggest surprises to us, because we wrote the book for leaders. But as the book has gotten out there and it's been reviewed and people are talking about it, the biggest piece of feedback we've gotten is, oh my gosh, this book is really for everybody. because it does apply in it for any situation. It doesn't just have to be work related. Anything else? I will be outside. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for everything you guys have done. Based on my experience here, what an amazing organization you guys have. So thank you.